It's time for The Outspoken Cyclist, your weekly conversation about bicycles, cyclists, trails, travel, advocacy, the bike industry, and much, much more. You can subscribe to our weekly podcast at outspokencyclist.com or through your favorite podcatching app to listen anytime. Now here's your host, Diane Jenks.
Hello and welcome to The Outspoken Cyclist. I'm your host, Diane Jenks. Thanks for tuning in today. I have a couple of quick notes before we get on with our guests today. I want to offer a huge congratulations to American Matteo Jorgenson from Team Visma Lease for winning Paris-Nice this past Sunday. It was spectacular. The weather was really nasty. The racing was daring and exciting. I think it was a great win for both the team and Matteo. And for those in Northeast Ohio who know the Detroit Superior Bridge over the flats, the streetcar deck will be transformed into a bike ped path with a $7 million grant awarded to Cuyahoga County by the U.S. Department of Transportation this week. Infrastructure dollars at work. Congratulations, Cleveland. It's a great East-West win. So today's episode features two very accomplished guests. First up is Mike Lydon. And where to begin? Let's see, Mike is an internationally recognized planner, writer, speaker, and advocate for livable cities. But wait, there's more. In fact, so much more that I would direct you to his website, street-plans.com, where there is a great description of what he does, and the accolades and projects he's been part of are enumerated. Mike will be with me in a moment. In the second half of the show, Dr. Ralph Buehler will be back to speak with us about his part in a study about what happened with cycling during and after the pandemic. Some of the findings might surprise you, some of them we already knew, and some of them give us insight into what we might expect in the future. So Mike Lydon, he seems to have been born to the profession of urban planning with a love for towns and cities from his childhood. His work has been acclaimed far and wide, and he thinks about what we can do on both a micro and macro level to realize better ways to make our cities livable and safe. Before we start, I want to make a correction to something I say early in our conversation. I mistakenly stated that the year the store I opened in downtown Cleveland was 1997. Nope, the year it was opened was actually 1989. Here's my conversation with Mike. Hi, Mike. Welcome to The Outspoken Cyclist. Thanks for joining me today. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. You've done a whole lot of stuff. You've gotten a whole lot of awards. You are like the poster person for the kind of work I love to do, and I'm not sure where to start. So let's start at the beginning. Give us a little bit about your background and what led you to doing what you're doing today, which is a lot.
Oh boy. Well, I grew up in rural Maine, in a small town, and was always obsessed with town and bigger towns and cities. And so anyways, I found my way into urban planning from a pretty young age. SimCity was a big catalyst for me, and did a lot of academic projects over the years through grade school, high school, college, et cetera. And then wound up realizing there was truly a profession built around, making cities better. And so wound up getting a degree in urban planning from University of Michigan, and wound up in Miami for 3 years doing large scale urban design, urban planning projects for a firm called DPZ there. And then was excited about that work, but certainly frustrated by the pace of change. And also being an urban cyclist in Miami, understanding that my life was, in danger every time you hit the streets there. And I was cycling to and from the office about 8 miles each day, one way. So it kind of came this part of my work, which was really advocacy and not so much consulting work, but advocacy work there, and help get some bike initiatives started, largely out of self-preservation. And, between that and being frustrated that things weren't happening, not only in Miami, but, in just urban planning in general, got really excited about some initiatives I got to be made aware of, from open streets or ciclovia down in Bogota, to some other activist-led projects that were really popping up everywhere at that time, kind of in reaction to the Great Recession, and then all these online tools that people were developing and able to share ideas and pictures, and got inspired and said, you know what, there's a common thread here. And it's what we call tactical urbanism, and we should really sort of build a practice around marrying streets, street design, transportation, and the need to tend to do that faster and to create an outlet for people who really care about these things to push cities and push themselves to really deliver safer communities. So that's the short history.
So I have a question about urban planning when you first started and urban planning now. I've been clearly watching it for more closely the last 4 or 5 years than I did the previous 8 when I first started the podcast. But I've been in the bicycle business for 40 years, and I've seen now what I felt have been really, really slow beginnings of trails and paths and connections and lack of connections does seem to be accelerating. The pace is accelerating. But I'm wondering about the thinking about urban planning, how you've seen it change from, more roads, more parking lots to what we're seeing today.
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that question. There's, I've been thinking about that recently. Where things were when I was in grad school and starting my career as a young planner, certainly not where they are today. At that point, it was still in many cities, most cities, it was, hey, can we get people to live downtown? Or how do we get people to invest in our core? Today, it's, oh my gosh, how do we hit the brakes on this? It's become so expensive. We can't build enough housing. Everybody wants to live a walkable lifestyle, and it's very, very expensive to do it. It wasn't that way, 20 years ago. I think a lot of cities were still desperate for people to live in the city somewhere or to live in the downtown area. And, we just spent many decades not building enough housing for people, and it's just become extremely expensive and challenging. And it really impacts many, many, many different issues, not just housing, but economic issues, transportation issues, community, relationship building issues. So I think that to me is like the biggest shift and change, is that you have a much greater demand and a big lack of supply, and it's really driving the conversation today in a way that it was not 20 years ago. As it relates to streets and public space and transportation, there's just been this huge awareness building campaign. It feels like through 1,000 different, 100,000 different actors to get our political leaders to understand the value and how important it is for multiple reasons to invest in safe cycling and walking, active travel, public transportation. And we're certainly not at the scale we all want to be at, but there's certainly much more awareness. And it's really the last couple of years you've seen this tipping point sort of be reached with getting rid of parking minimums, and the whole parking reform movement has taken off. The YIMBY movement in terms of housing and being very housing positive for communities, and that's starting to have real impact on the political spectrum across the country, and that's really exciting to see.
Well, anecdotally, and I can do it from my own perspective, in 1997, we had the bright idea of opening a really high-end, beautiful space, rehabbing a 1920-something space in downtown Cleveland, in between what is Tower City and the lakefront, in what they called the warehouse district. And exactly what you said was going on. Nobody came downtown. There wasn't enough housing. There were no groceries. There were no drugstores. There were no dry cleaners. So it really, while it was a beautiful space, once 5 o'clock rolled out, that was it. Everybody left downtown. So I totally get it. And I also see they're trying to take all of these buildings that used to be department stores and whatever and turn them into housing. And you're right. It's expensive, and it's not happening fast enough. It's just crazy. It's crazy. Let me reintroduce you, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the actual work you're doing right now. We're speaking with Mike Lydon. He is an internationally recognized planner, writer, speaker, and advocate for livable cities, which everybody knows I'm way into that. His company is Street Plans, and I wanted to talk about tactical urbanism. Define it for us.
Oh, yes. It's a wonky term for using short-term projects to affect long-term change. And it's all about very intentionally doing so. So seeing a problem or a challenge in the built environment, and then knowing that a fix won't happen in a permanent way tomorrow, but there are things that we can do tomorrow that would inform and impact and build support for that long-term investment. So we use that as a tool in our practice in a lot of different types of ways in a wide variety of projects, but it really is a way to have people participate in the creation of their city and then to use as a sort of diagnostic tool to see, is there political support for this? If so, what works about this, what doesn't? Let's make sure we don't, hardline infrastructure investments that are not going to work in the long term. So in some ways, it's a very radical strategy. In a lot of ways, it's a very conservative strategy in that you're sort of hedging against big, dumb money being spent on projects that shouldn't be spent that way.
So give us an example of a couple of projects that started out being sort of temporary. And I think COVID drove a lot of things to new thinking, but that have then turned into permanent solutions.
Sure. I mean, there's a sort of a long history there of various projects that have gone through that trajectory. And, there are some that take 3 years to go through that cycle, not many, but some. And then there are some that take 15 or 20 years to go through that cycle. It really just depends on the context and the project. I'll talk about one that I was not involved with, but extremely inspired by, 15 or 16 years ago, which is right here in Dumbo, Brooklyn, where we have our office now. Back in 2007, the city in the relatively newly formed business improvement district in this neighborhood painted a green triangle in what was a sort of angled parking lot in a big expanse of asphalt. They just painted it green and threw out some planters and said, look, now it's a plaza. And that image is one that is still burned in my memory from, just maybe joining Twitter in 2007 or 8 and thinking that is super cheap and that is super effective. And that project has gone through probably 3 different iterations since it was first installed in 2007. I mean, different temporary iterations. So green at first, then a mural got painted on top, and then a new mural, and then a whole bunch of programming and configuration changes have happened with that space, from holiday festivals to a flea market to art events, all happening in this little triangle in this sort of really kind of beautiful dynamic space, really serving as the public space that the neighborhood always needed as it continued to grow. And now that it's 2024, about a year ago, they started construction on not just making that little triangle permanent, but expanding it pretty dramatically by closing the adjacent street to through traffic and then connecting it to an existing plaza in the archway underneath the Manhattan Bridge. So you're getting this very large, new, permanent, beautiful, rebuilt public space that never would have happened and never would have been as valuable to the community had it not been done first with paint. So again, that's a long arc to go from 2007 to 2024, and it's still not quite done. But the value creation and the benefit for the community and the city in that interim period of 15 years is tremendous. And I think that's the increment of opportunity that people always miss, thinking like, yeah, we're going to invest in this long term, but don't forget to think of those short-term investments that actually drive the value and bring the benefit, and then you can learn from them for what you actually wind up building with permanent infrastructure. So it's a really, really cool story, and it sort of kicked off the plaza program here in New York City. Now there's more than 75 different plazas like that in different phases of development. So the projects and the methodology don't just scale and iterate and become permanent over time. They can become programmatic. They can become a citywide sort of approach to change making. And that's what's happened here in New York. And I think it's really, really cool.
So I have a question about pushback. When things like that start, people are always skeptical, or you're taking away my whatever, the NIMBY thing, not in my backyard. By doing it incrementally, do you think that you get more buy-in, that people become more in favor of it and begin to actually support it and then, help it grow?
It certainly helps. I mean, we're all about showing, not telling, right? People, one, they don't like to be told, right?
True.
Anything really. But if you can get away with showing them even for a weekend or a month, it's that experience, that visual experience of like, oh, I actually still found a parking spot, or, I actually enjoyed seeing all that positive activity in the neighborhood. It does really help to change hearts and minds. Of course, not everybody, obviously, but that experiential change means a lot. And what's so powerful about the the flexibility and the non-permanence of the materials is that you can literally adjust and change things as you're seeing, like, okay, maybe we've gotten over the big hump of should it be here, but this isn't quite working the way that we intended or the way we wanted to, or we've got a complaint from this resident who says X about this project. And you're like, okay, we can move this piece over there, reconfigure this, and then, we'll not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We'll still keep the project, but we will be able to tweak it so that it responds to how it's used on the ground effectively. So it's really helpful to be able to do that with projects as you work out the kinks, and you can't do that the same way with permanent hardscape infrastructure.
Let's take a short break. And when we come back, I want to talk about the infrastructure bill and how that's either loosened up or not, monies for these kinds of projects and what projects you might have on the drawing board right now. We're speaking with Mike Lydon. He is the principal of Street Plans. He is in New York City. And I know you have offices elsewhere, including Florida, which is one of those problematic states in my mind for biking. And he's an internationally recognized planner, writer, speaker, and advocate for livable cities. We'll be right back. You're listening to The Outspoken Cyclist. We are back on The Outspoken Cyclist. I'm your host, Diane Jenks, and we're speaking with Mike Lydon from Street Plans. So how has infrastructure money helped some of the work you're doing right now? And is it helping?
A lot of the work that we do, let me back up. Money gets allocated at the federal level. Money doesn't start flowing at the local level for a very long time. So
Okay.
we directly haven't seen any immediate benefit, but we have some projects that are coming up that are funded with infrastructure dollars that we hope are going to be very impactful. And one of those projects is in New Haven, Connecticut, where we'd actually help the city complete a cycling and walking and transit plan called Safe Routes for All. And then we're able to, once the Safe Streets and Roads for All, very actually coincidentally named in a very similar way, program got released by FHWA for $5 billion over 5 years. We were able to pivot that plan to make it eligible to apply for infrastructure dollar money, not planning money because we already did the plan, but infrastructure money. And we wound up getting some success out of that. And so that's taken a while to go through the whole contracting agreement phase between the federal government and the city. But we are taking some of the priority projects in a corridor out of the plan that touches a couple of the city's equity priority neighborhoods, and we'll be able to invest those dollars in changing the corridor to make it much safer for walking, cycling, transit use, and of course driving. And it's right where there's a high school, there's an early age elementary school, there's a lot of dense housing around, and it's going to be an opportunity on that corridor to really make a difference. And so that will start flowing, probably later this year. That project will advance with those federal dollars. Overall, we're seeing that stuff start from year one, really start to now get into the planning and development phase. There's going to be many more years of that if the current administration, I think, stays in office for the next 6 years or 5 years or whatnot. And that's exciting too, because what the money is doing is basically convincing or bringing departments of transportation at a state level to the table and realizing that some of the things that are eligible to be funded with those infrastructure dollars are things they're not very comfortable with or haven't been historically. So it's opening up the eyes and I think the attention from a policy and a design perspective on what's possible in our streets, including doing tactical quick build projects, of which this version of New Haven is what we will wind up doing. So we've worked on a lot of those kinds of projects with local municipalities. We've not had nearly the same amount of buy-in from state DOTs, and I think that's starting to change. And that's all because of the carrot on the end of the stick, which is called billions of dollars.
Right, exactly. This didn't occur to me before, but I wanted to ask you about it because my guess is you've run up across it, and I don't know how it gets fixed. When the national federal interstate system was built, a lot of communities were divided so that you had something on one side and something else on the other, and this highway going down the middle, resulting in some very inequitable situations. And when somebody says we're going to get rid of that, what do you do? How do you get rid of that highway, and what do you put in its place, and where do you send that traffic?
You blow up the highway. That's what you do with it. You just
Okay, I'm all
demolish
for
it.
that.
Bye-bye. No, I mean, it's a very intensive process and project to kind of think about how you physically remove something, which, it's obviously was extremely destructive when it was built, but it's not like taking it down is like a cakewalk either and takes a lot
Right.
of time, right? But what it does leave is these huge gashes of land, these corridors, 100 feet, sometimes much wider swaths of land that can be redeveloped and reimagined. And now that we're in 2024, there's a handful of communities who have done this successfully over the last couple of decades. Rochester, New York is one of the more recent ones where you can see in multiple phases they've been removing this inner ring highway, which really was pointless as a infrastructure when it got built, but it sort of created this noose around the downtown. And so taking that out in pieces has allowed for an at-grade street, which still moves plenty of cars, but then to incorporate walking facilities and protected bike lanes and all that extra land to build new housing, right? And repair the city and bring people to live downtown. So I think the trade-offs are immense when you think about the removal. And then the downside of, well, what happens to the traffic? Well, a lot of it evaporates. There's not a theory, but there's been proven that when you remove capacity, you get less cars, you get less demand to use that infrastructure. So that's really hard for people to understand politically, at a neighborhood level, conceptually, whatever. But when you see that infrastructure removed, you see traffic counts shrink, you see less crashes, you see cleaner air, you see land opened up for housing and commercial development, you get better walking and biking facilities. So it's the trade-offs and the benefits are immense if you can pull it off.
Something you mentioned about taking these things out and having these big swaths of land. How is climate change affecting the work you're doing?
It's pretty central. I mean, it's this massive global issue and challenge, right? But the only thing you can do is work at it, block by block and at a local or municipal level. I mean, sure, some projects and efforts go well beyond that, but for the everyday planner or advocate, you've got to be thinking about how you can position the work that you do to contribute to reducing and mitigating the damage that has been done and will continue to be done via climate change. So for us, that's designing streets that are literally greener, not just green paint for cycling, but actual have a lot more space for landscape to absorb water, to bring shade, which is so critical. I was actually having a conversation yesterday about the value of shade and obviously the microclimate that you can have on a single block between an area that's shade and the area that's not. So all of that has to be top of mind when we're thinking about not just permanent infrastructure investment and planning for that, but how do we do that in the short term, in the temporary way as well? And one example from our portfolio of projects is that we had worked in Norfolk, Virginia, maybe 7 years ago at this point, and they're a city that's really in trouble when it comes to rising sea level, right? But they also are getting increased rain events. So they're getting water coming up from below and through the sewer system, but they're also getting these bigger rains from above. And that combination of that is not good. So how do you take a tactical approach to something that's so systemic? Well, you've got to chip away at it. And so what we wound up doing was having this workshop with, at the time, a group called 100 Resilient Cities and a bunch of property owners and residents of a couple neighborhoods that were most impacted by this issue of stormwater and sea level change. And we tested out rain barrels and we showed them what a rain garden looks like. We really built these things and hooked them up to a roof. And we actually had the fire department on the roof using a hose to blast water down, on the roof. So it would go into the drain. And then you could see how in real time, you could see the rain barrel catch the water and delay it from going into the stormwater system. And so really it was about education. And then we, through that workshop and through that 2-day process, came up with a series of recommendations on how the city could use this small scale green and blue infrastructure to mitigate the stormwater challenges they were facing. And they, to their credit, put this program in place where they offer, I think it's twice a year, they offer grants of $2,500 to property owners to hook up and build this type of infrastructure, which is not very expensive. And they've done that now for, I think it's been 6 years. And so if you add up all the grants and all the projects over 6 years, you start to make a dent on this stuff, right? You can't just silver bullet your way out of it. But if you can work with property owners at sort of like a network scale across the city, you can start to make a difference at a low cost.
How are you incorporating charging stations for things, not just cars, but also e-bikes, scooters, some of the ride share stuff?
Hmm. We're not. We don't really get into the charging infrastructure game for
Okay.
vehicles, although I think there's a fight that needs to be had over that.
Hmm.
We've locked in on-street parking, which also creates demand for driving when it's so convenient and it's free.
Right.
We've locked that in for many generations now. And to just assume that we should keep using the curb always that way by putting curbside charging stations in is maybe problematic. We just saw a proposal or an article today, actually, here in New York City, that the city's investing a huge amount of money in rolling out from a pilot into a much bigger scale installation of all these chargers at the curb. But what that does is it locks in that use
Right.
um,
And the space.
and the space. And today, when you need to fill your car with gas, you go to a centralized place. You go to a gas station, which concentrates the source of power delivery. Spreading that out to every neighborhood will mean that you aren't adding all the other things you need to do, like greenery. It makes bike lanes challenging now because now you have cars that have to access the curb. So there's a lot of questions that need to be answered about how we do this. I should step back. I believe in electrification. I think that's going to be an important piece of this, but how we do the electrification and where really matters. And, all this is happening here in New York while you have a whole large, like hundreds of thousands of delivery cyclists here who all run on e-bikes who don't have easy access to public charging. And what that means is they're doing it in basements, they're doing it illegally. Oftentimes the batteries are not certified, so they're not safe. And there's been, I can tell you how many fires have broken out this last couple of years based on the unsafe charging batteries. So it's very pernicious, and we're just not, like, left hand's not talking to the right on these issues yet. In the least, these public charging stations need to accommodate not just for cars, but for, micromobility as well.
Yeah, that seems to me like somebody with an engineering mind should come up with a vehicle that is self-charging.
Well,
that wouldn't need these stations every 5 seconds,
Right. And, the technology will improve and the batteries will
it
last
will.
longer over time, but we're not there yet at all. And, think about the 1940s or 50s and all these cities were introducing on-street parking and metering and or not. And what that did, like in New York, you couldn't park on the street before 1950. So it's this moment right now where we're sort of, are we going to do this again? And are we locking it in? And how are we doing it? Like, this is a really big move from a policy perspective. And I don't think it's all been thought out enough, not only in New York, but I think definitely nationally, it's not been well thought out.
So before I ask you a couple of personal questions, I want to know if you have a big picture vision. If you could, in the perfect world, what a city might look like and act like in the future.
Well, I think a city should be for everybody who wants to live there to be able to live there. And at the moment, that's not the case. Cities are our best engines of economic opportunity, and they're really probably the best tool to fight climate change from a emissions perspective, right? If you truly live a lifestyle where you don't have to drive for anything or drive very little, the value of that, sharing party walls and buildings is incredibly energy efficient. Being able to walk to the corner to get all your groceries and your daily needs is incredibly efficient and is a huge tool to fight against climate change. So my dream vision is that we have a lot more cities, we have bigger cities, and we have better ways to connect all of our cities, and that people can live there who want to live there and find opportunity. And that's a city we don't have right now in the United States, is my opinion.
Are there cities around the world that are worth emulating that aren't places like Amsterdam, where it's small and it's flat and it's, you mentioned Bogota, and I can't remember his name. Go ahead.
I think cities around the world are doing certain things really well. And so you can't learn from just one city. You need to think about, all the interesting things that cities have done over generations, honestly, and learn from them and see what can be adapted, as there's political will to do so in your own city. So I wouldn't point to one city and say, hey, it's perfect. Paris is doing amazing things with its streets. I wouldn't say they've done a lot with, housing per se. Housing is still very, very expensive there. Tokyo, on the other hand, has done amazing things with housing and building and making it affordable, but they really don't have much bike infrastructure or, they've got these big, nasty streets too. So they haven't solved that problem. So, no city has it all worked out. That's for sure. It's all about learning from the good things that people have been able to pull off, in my opinion.
Well, and then you also have in the United States cities that are so disparate in size and in geography, and like we have the Great Lake here, and you have the Hudson River, and there are just so many variables. I understand that. So what do you do when you're not working, which it seems like you're probably working 28 hours a day?
I do work probably too much. Well, I've got two little boys, so and along with my wife, we love to go out into the city and just visit different places, go to different parks. We ride bikes everywhere. I've got an electric cargo bike where the kids sit on the back, and they're age 3 and 6, so they're still relatively easy to cycle around with. They're not too big and heavy yet. So we do a lot of that. I'm also a runner, so I love to run around New York or whatever city I'm visiting. The first thing I like to do is get off the plane and go run. Oftentimes, in a park or along the waterway, whatever is a good way to kind of see neighborhoods and see the city. So that's a big passion of mine. I do a lot of that. And other than that, I do a lot of thinking and reading about urban planning.
I'll bet you do. Well, it's been a pleasure to speak with you. How can my listeners find out more about you and the work and street plans and tactical urbanism?
Yeah, you can go to streetplans.com, check out our website. You can go to tacticalurbanismguide.com, check out some of the resources we have there. I should also say we're working on a new book. So we released a book in 2015 about tactical urbanism, and we have a new book coming out probably this time next year with Island Press that we're currently writing. So that's going to be a big download of all the things that we've learned over a decade of practicing tactical urbanism at Street Plans and with many, many collaborators and partners. And you can find me on all the social medias, Twitter and Instagram and all that.
Yeah, Island Press is really a good publishing house for the kind of work you do, and a lot of the bicycling stuff. I really appreciate the work they do. Well, It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for speaking with me. We've been speaking with Mike Lydon. He is with Street Plans, and it's streetplans.com. I hope you have a great spring. Enjoy the weather when it gets there, and I hope we get to talk again.
Thanks, Ann. Appreciate it.
My thanks to Mike Lydon for joining me on the show today. You can find out more about his work at street-plans.com, including some of the really cool projects the organization has worked on. Follow Mike on social media at Mike Lydon. Let's take a break, and when we return, we'll speak with Professor Ralph Buehler about his findings from his study, Cycling Through the COVID-19 Pandemic. You're listening to The Outspoken Cyclist. We are back on The Outspoken Cyclist. I'm your host, Diane Jenks. The COVID-19 pandemic changed the way we behave in so many ways. We found ourselves learning a new way of moving about, and whether it was going to and coming from work, shopping for groceries, or just getting outside for pleasure, the impact of the worldwide need to alter the way we travel is a topic of great interest to my guest, Dr. Ralph Buehler. Ralph joins me to discuss his findings, which were published recently in an article titled COVID-19 Impacts on Cycling. Hi, Ralph. Welcome back to The Outspoken Cyclist. Good to talk with you. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. We all got through COVID, it seems, pretty well. And what we're going to talk about today has to do with COVID and some of the research you've been doing. It's been a while since we spoke. And you mentioned in a study in Transport Reviews titled, quote, COVID-19 and Cycling, a review of the literature on changes in cycling levels and government policies from 2019 to 2022. Explain how and why this study was done.
So first, I apologize for the long title, but these academic titles are always a handful. So as we all experienced, I think COVID was a big shock to our lives and to our behavior. And part of that was also related to bicycling. People stopped going to work. They worked from home more. People wanted to get outside for recreation and just getting outside of the house. So there was big changes in how people get around. And we were interested in A, what happened during COVID to bicycling, and then B, how are these trends sort of panning out over the years? So what happened in 2021 and 2022 compared to 2020? And we wanted to see what we know in the literature out there.
And you did learn a lot. As somebody who's been in the bike business, the experiences we had were things like product shortages and everybody digging bikes out of basements and garages and just getting on a bike to get outside, number one, and to figure out what the social distancing was. And if somebody sneezed, how far behind them you should be riding. I mean, it was some really weird and kind of silly stuff in some ways, but it was very serious in other ways. So what was the literature saying as you began to look at it?
So there's a lot of variability in over time. There's a lot of variability by geography. This means by country, by city, but also by parts of the city. For example, we saw big declines in cycling in business districts or close to universities because suddenly the bike commuters who went to these business districts to work and the students who went to these universities, they didn't bike there anymore. So cycling declined a lot. And if there was a bike counter along a route to one of these, we saw declines in cycling. But at the same time, we saw big increases in cycling in other places, often on recreational shared use trails or in neighborhoods or in other locations. The same was true also by time of day. We saw declines in bicycling in the morning because precisely people were not going to work anymore. They were not commuting, but we saw big increases in cycling on the weekends and in the afternoons because that's when people were out now riding their bikes. So the research shows a lot of variability. Overall, though, we saw increases in bicycling. So bicycling came out stronger of the pandemic than it went in.
Do we know who was cycling mainly? I mean, we think about cycling. When I think about cycling, my clientele has always been skewed male and skewed somewhere in the middle age, say 39 to 55. Did that change during the pandemic?
It changed a little bit, but again, there's lots of variability. Several studies show that those who increased their cycling or picked up cycling were also mainly men, middle-aged, and younger. But some studies show that, in particular along streets that were closed for cars or new pop-up bike lanes they were put in, they find that more women were riding there and that older individuals were riding there. The same is, I think, true for younger kids. And I will tell a private anecdote here that's not in the research, but during the lockdowns, I was riding with my two kids who were 5 and 7 at the time. We were riding 3 abreast along the streets because nobody was out. No cars were out and they loved it. Now, if I tell them, let's go for a bike ride, they will tell me, there are all the cars and it's dangerous. So we had people who were more risk averse, if they know it, like the little kids, if they don't know it, like the little kids, or if they know it, like adults, that rode more bikes. But again, there's variability in the places and the type of facility where people were riding.
Let me reintroduce you, and then we're going to talk a little more about some of the things that have happened as we've moved out of COVID and into what's happening today. We're speaking with Dr. Ralph Buehler. He's a professor of urban affairs and planning in the School of Public and International Affairs at Virginia Tech's Research Center in Arlington. And your area of research has an international comparative perspective. So did you study this COVID phenomenon of more cycling for a while and then maybe it's tapered off outside of the U.S.?
Yes, so we studied it in the US, in Canada, in European countries, and we also reviewed studies from Australia, some from Asia, and some even from Africa on that. In general, we find these similar trends that during the pandemic, that means after the lockdowns, because during lockdowns, often people didn't ride their bikes because in some countries you were not allowed to leave your house. So if you left your house, you had to have a sheet of paper saying, I go there, and you had to have a reason to go somewhere. But once these lockdowns were lifted, we generally saw increases in bicycling all over. If it's Australia, if it's Canada, if it's the US, if it's the European countries. We reviewed a study from Vietnam where we saw that mainly cycling in parks in that study, but we saw general increases right during the pandemic. And then there's big variability in what cities did in terms of accommodating this cycling. Some cities did very little. there was just less car traffic because people stayed at home, and some people rode their bikes because there were fewer cars out there. And other cities really took the COVID pandemic as an opportunity almost to expand their bikeway networks. The cities that come to mind, there are Paris, France, for example, or Brussels, Belgium. They had plans for expanding their bikeway networks. And then the pandemic hit and they said, wait a minute, we have all these plans, we know the routes. Why don't we do very cheap pop-up bike lanes along those routes? And they really expanded their bikeway network. And they saw the strongest increases in cycling and also the most sustained increases because they made many of these pop-up bike lanes permanent, sort of growing their bikeway network considerably. And those were the cities that sort of kept the cycling at a higher level than cities that didn't do anything or that pulled back their pop-up bike lanes.
So this is sort of outside of the study that you did, but I wonder if you've noticed some of these places that have either allowed their infrastructure to become more permanent, having people maybe narrowing streets, calming traffic, putting more bike lanes in. Has the infrastructure bill made any difference, do you think, out of this? I don't know if it came out of COVID or not. It almost feels like it should have.
Yeah, I mean, so in the US, so the availability of funds or the flexibility of funds on the local level is very important. So local governments can decide what to do with the federal funds they get. So historically, US federal transport funding came with strings attached. So you got the money and you could only use it for roadways, or you could only use it for transit. And that has gotten more flexible over time. And then with the infrastructure bill, there has also been more money. And the communities who wanted to use it that way, they could do that. But I think with the quick reaction with these pop-up bike lanes to COVID, that was more about the local government sort of having the idea to use this moment and local agency to do something. Because often they put up these little cones and it was very sort of makeshift to do it. And then later when the funds came in or they had the funds, they could make them permanent. And the political will, by the way.
Well, yeah, political will. There's always that. So I wondered about some of the phenomenon that I heard, and it's anecdotal. It is not necessarily, fact, but maybe is some of the changes that have occurred for drivers making cycling, even during the pandemic, somewhat more dangerous, that they're going faster, there are fewer cars on the road, that they're angry. I don't know if any of that came into the study that you were doing.
It didn't come into the study, but it's a very troubling trend, which, by the way, is a US trend.
Of course.
Yes, of course, and not of course, because all the logical arguments that you made, well, there's less congestion, drivers are faster, and that's why crashes are more impactful. The same happened in Europe, for example. There were fewer cars out there, the people could drive faster, but we didn't see the increase in cyclist fatalities and pedestrian fatalities, by the way, as we saw it in the US. So it's a very troubling trend in the US, and that trend, for pedestrians at least, has been ongoing for 10 years, even before COVID. So we have a really bad traffic safety problem here in the US, and it's mainly pedestrians, but also cyclists that get killed at a higher rate by drivers. We still have to fully figure out why that is. We had a spike during the pandemic, likely related to some of the factors you mentioned. We also have larger vehicles with higher hoods that are more likely to kill you when they hit you. Also bigger mass that's more likely to hit you to kill you when you get hit. And we may have more speeding. So there are many other factors that play a role, but I wouldn't pin it solely on the pandemic. It may have amplified an ongoing trend, but we have this trend in the US, I would say since 2012 at least, for pedestrians, to some extent for cyclists.
So this is the third episode of my show in a row that we've brought this up, this trend of more pedestrians and cyclists being killed on the road. And every time it's come up, the topic of e-bikes gets injected somehow. I don't know if you're doing any study looking at e-bikes or not, but when I talk to the NTSB, they are not getting data that gives us an opportunity to sort of analyze whether e-bikes are the problem or a problem.
I would say e-bikes, there may be an issue with e-bikes, but e-bikes can't be the problem that pedestrians get killed.
True.
So if we have a trend for pedestrians and cyclists, then I would first go and blame the drivers because they are killing both. E-bikes is another issue. E-bikes are, of course, faster, allow people to go faster than with other bikes, and a fall at a higher speed is more dangerous than a fall at a lower speed. I think that's pretty clear. But I haven't seen any good data that sort of says that e-bikes are at the root of this issue. And if it were just e-bikes, then we wouldn't see the trend for pedestrians at all, because they're not motorized with an electric motor. And then the other thing with e-bikes is, of course, the way they are ridden. Just because you have an e-bike does not mean that you have to go fast. You can go fast, but people who ride e-bikes may just people who would not ride otherwise, or they ride an e-bike for a longer distance than they would ride otherwise. So not every e-bike user is a reckless person who is just racing to fall down. So I would be a little bit careful with the e-bikes. I don't rule it out that there's an issue, given the higher speed, but the overall national trend, I think we see is related to driving, in particular because we see it for pedestrians as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation, one that nobody else has actually couched it that way, and I appreciate that. I can see that is probably so. So let's fast forward to now, because we're going to give people a link to your study and to it's part of a much larger study, your portion of it. But what do you think is going to happen going forward in terms of, there seems to be a decline right now in cycling. There's a decline in bike sales. Shops are reporting suddenly a glut of inventory when they had nothing during the pandemic. Do you see this balancing out at some point?
Yeah, it's difficult where we are at the moment. So we have these places that I talked about before, like Paris, France, or Brussels, that are really on the up and up. In New York, I think, in the US, I think New York City looks very strong in their bicycling trend. But many other cities like Portland, Oregon, or Minneapolis, that used to sort of be the big cycling cities, at least the bike commute hasn't come back. And I think that's one of the key issues here is what's going to happen to our commuting behavior. And especially for cities where commuting was a big thing, like Portland or Minneapolis. And a big share of the population is still working from home, if not permanently, then maybe 2 days a week. So people go to the office on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, but they're not going to the office Monday and Friday. And so these are bike trips that are missing. We don't see them in the commute data. We don't see them at our counters. At the same time, we still see higher cycling levels or increases along certain recreational trails and recreational activities. So I think it's still up in the air how it will pan out. And then, of course, the cities who didn't make the bike infrastructure permanent or didn't do anything for cycling, they lost all the people again who rode bikes before, because now they are having a bad experience. And it only needs one close pass by a car or one close encounter, and you say, "Hey, I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this anymore. This is too dangerous. Or feels too dangerous for me." So we still have to see how it goes. But I think we have to have this big spike during COVID, and we're down from that. But overall, I think we're not down below where we started in 2019. We're still above that. We are below the big peak we had maybe in 2020, 21. I think we come out ahead of 2019, but in a different way. We won't see the commute numbers return because some of the work from home will stick, at least for parts of the week. And then for us as researchers, the challenge then is how to find the cyclists, or how to count them. We used to rely a lot on the US Census or American Community Survey that counts workers that commute to work. And that indicator is going to be a bad indicator going forward, because it's so far below for most modes than what it was before the pandemic. So we have to find new ways of counting cyclists and finding cyclists and figuring out what they do. But overall, I'm optimistic, most optimistic for the cities that really pushed bicycling and took COVID as an opportunity to expand bikeways. Less optimistic for places that didn't do much or that rely heavily on bike commuters.
So as paths and trails begin to be completed, so there are lots of sort of sections of trails that never went anywhere. It went from one block to another or 1 mile or whatever. But I'm seeing some things starting to connect, for example, in our area, Northeast Ohio. I'm wondering if you think that would be a place that you would start counting as opposed to city streets for commuters.
Yeah, I mean, these are places where you have to start counting at these connected networks or at intersections where major trunks or routes of the network intersect. There's also a whole new push towards passively generated data. So it's your cell phone that whenever you get an app that seems free, you agree to all sorts of things that you don't know about. But it means that there are people who take your data and they also use it for transport planning. So your bike trip will show up there. There are, of course, other bike apps where more regular cyclists who want to track their rides, where they report their data and we can follow.
Yeah, like Strava.
Yeah. So we have to sort of rely on different data sources, or maybe you do that as well. Like I get from my phone once a month, I get a report from Google where I went everywhere, and they show me a map and they show me different places. I don't know if I ever agreed to it, but
there it is.
it started popping up. But the point is, there are people who are having data or collecting that data, and you're exactly right. We have to count where networks come together or where important routes of networks connect, and put counters up at those locations.
So what is the next thing you're working on now that this project is sort of where it is? It's been published.
Yeah, so we have been working more recently on something that was not related directly to cycling. We were working on travel behavior of older adults, how do older adults change their travel behavior over time. It's a very interesting group because it's a growing group. So we're going to have more and more older adults in the population as a share of the population, and older adults are also changing in the sense that they are more active than previous generations of older adults. And so the question is, how do they get around? Do they drive more? Do they ride transit? Do they ride bicycles? Do they walk more? And what are the projections into the future? But it's more related to all modes of transport and not specifically to bicycling. We have a comparison in there as well, where we look at the US and at Germany. Not surprisingly, German older adults ride bikes more, walk more, but maybe shockingly, the growth rates, because they started at a lower level, the growth rates in car use are much higher in Germany. So older adults one generation ago drove a lot less than now. In the US, older adults drove at higher rates already, and they're sort of flatlining or growing minimally, while there's huge growth in Germany, for example. And that's bad news for their sustainability goals, because older adults are accounting for a larger share of the population.
Right.
They drive a lot more. There will be more CO2 emissions and all sorts of other things that didn't exist before. But it takes us a little bit away from the bicycling research, more into looking at elder adults and their travel behavior. I also wanted to make one other point, and I'm not sure how it is related, but you mentioned that there may be a sort of a decline in cycling or less interest in cycling. And I'm wondering, and I haven't seen any good research on that, but how e-scooters and these other new micromobility modes, how they relate to cycling. Because we had in the early 2010s or so, bicycling was the cool thing to do. Like if you went to cities, new young urbanites who moved there, they picked up bicycles because it was sort of the cool thing. But now we also have more of these e-scooters and other modes that are sort of the cool thing, or the coolness factor. And I haven't seen any good studies sort of evaluating that. Are the e-scooters complements to bicycling? You may ride a bike for some trips, you may ride e-scooters for others, or is there some competition between them? So you want to be seen more likely on an e-scooter these days, because that's the better mode to be on than a bike. And I don't know. I haven't seen any of that.
That's an interesting question. E-scooters have come up a couple of times in the conversations I've had, and I know we have different, like the bike share, scooter share, that you can use your phone and get a scooter and take it somewhere. I don't know. They scare me just to look at them. I fell off a skateboard once. That's enough for me. So, I'm not looking at going on a scooter anytime soon. But I just think that cycling has somehow taken a hit. And part of it also, and I don't know if you've studied this at all, part of it has to do with the cost of entry. Bicycles are very expensive right now, in my opinion. I mean, I've been in this business 40 plus years, so I've seen the changes. And yes, of course, there's inflation and there's all of those things, but I think the manufacturers have a lot to do with it. So I'm wondering how bicycling is faring in terms of people being able to get into it. It's not an inexpensive purchase.
I mean, but I think bike stores have had bikes at higher price points. Like I remember when I came to the US, the first bike I bought as a student was it $50 or $80 at Walmart. It was a very cheap bike. But it did the trick to get me around campus and get me
Right.
to the grocery store. And I haven't looked in a while where that price point is for the really low quality bike that's sort of the entry bike, and I don't know how that has moved. But it was not a good ride. In fact, the pedals fell off when I rode it because they hadn't attached them properly, or they didn't know how to attach them properly. But that's a different story.
You also have parents who are more fearful of letting their children ride by themselves.
I mean, that's a whole other story. And we did a study a while ago on just general trends in travel behavior of active travel in the US over time. So we looked at 2001 and 2017. That's what 2 national household travel surveys occurred. And what we had found there was, and that was very shocking, and it fits your point, is we had found increases in cycling between 2001 and 2017 among adults, especially around 20 to 40-year-olds, but huge drops in bicycling for those younger than 16. And huge, like 50%, gigantic drops. And the same also was true for walking. And then at the time, we looked a little bit at, started investigating what's happening with children and why are they not riding. And one is the point you made that adults may not feel comfortable letting them ride. But what we also came across, at least anecdotally, is that many kids don't learn how to ride a bike anymore. So we ran into many people who said it's not a rite of passage anymore. You do not necessarily know how to ride a bike because your parents never put you on a bike, or they don't think it's necessary to do that. We got that a little bit confirmed through at least, again, it's anecdotal, but a school program where in the school they are teaching cycling, and it's in 3rd grade, I think. And what the program ran into, and I don't name any cities or places, but
Sure.
but what they ran into was that they wanted to teach traffic safety rules in 3rd grade. And what they found out is that many of the kids couldn't ride a bike. So what they had to do they had to bring in these a little bit larger Strider bikes to sort of get them to learn how to balance, and then later add the pedals on. But they had gone in and wanted to teach safety rules, but that was not what was needed. What was needed for many of the kids was to actually teach them how to ride a bicycle. So that was quite shocking at the time when I learned about that. And of course, we have the other thing that children may travel less overall, so they meet their friends online, they connect on a video game, and then they're still together, but they're both at home, or they're all at home at their screens, so they're traveling less. And then of course, with the increasing sprawl, that may just be easier for the parents or for everyone to connect the kids on an app rather than having them go to places or get to places. But that's actually for the future. That's a very bad sign, because if somebody doesn't learn how to ride a bike, never feels comfortable riding a bike, it's not a matter of reminding them of what it was like to ride a bike as a kid. It's something completely new to get them out. And I get that to some extent, not as extreme as I just said. Every summer I take about 20 students to Europe for a study abroad, and in one bike-friendly city in Freiburg, I put those who volunteer, and typically all do, on bikes to ride bicycles. But many are not comfortable riding a bike because they haven't ridden for so long. And typically what we have to do is we have to put the seat of the bike low enough that they can always reach the ground with both feet flat, which makes it much harder for riding because it's not easy riding. But again, it also speaks to this idea that children do not necessarily ride a lot or do not ride at all these days. And that's something that's concerning.
It is very concerning to me. That's like not teaching your child to swim. I mean, I kind of equate the two, that they both are necessary exercises or things that you need to learn. And well, that's another whole topic. And fortunately, I don't have little children, so I'm past that. But it is scary that parents are not teaching their children to ride a bike. I mean, I remember getting my first bike. I think I was 6 and was told, don't go out of the driveway. Immediately went out of the driveway and fell down. And my father said, see, told you, skinned your knees. But I learned to ride a bike, And so today, to think that kids are not riding bikes is very disturbing. It's very disturbing to me.
It is, and it's a big part of independence, like being able to get places under your own power, and you decide where you want to go. I think it's besides learning the act of bicycling, it's part of freedom and part of self-determination for the kids. So it's really a bad trend. But we saw that very strongly in that 2001-2017 National Household Travel Survey data for children.
Sounds to me like a really good campaign that the bike industry could get behind, is getting to parents to teach their kids how to ride a bike. It seems to me that would be a really good way to get a new generation of children on bicycles. Yeah, that would be awesome.
Or convincing more schools to actually do bike riding training.
That too, yeah.
Physical education.
Right. Well, Ralph, thank you so much for taking time to talk with me today. We've been speaking with Professor Ralph Buehler. He is at the Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs. You have a website of your own. Would you tell my listeners how to follow you and know about some of the work you're doing?
Yeah, so my website is ralphbuehbu.wordpress.com. You can just Google my name, Ralph Buehler, Virginia Tech, and then my professional website at Virginia Tech and my own website will pop up. You can also find me on LinkedIn if you just Google Ralph Buehler. And I'm also still on Twitter. I'm not sure for how much longer.
Me too. I'm not sure why.
So I really loved Twitter in the past, but it has really taken a nosedive, at least in terms of activity on my account.
I agree. Well, thank you again for talking with me. It's always a pleasure. And I really enjoy learning what you're doing because it really kind of dovetails with all the other work that I'm doing. So have a great spring and summer. I hope you get to do a lot of riding this year, and we'll talk again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
My thanks to Dr. Buehler for joining me today. I've put a link to his study on our website, outspokencyclist.com, or you can find it online at the Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs under Dr. Ralph Buehler's bio. There are quite a few other articles you can click on and read also. It is concerning that young people aren't learning to ride a bike. I didn't expect that when we first started talking. I hope you're teaching your children and grandchildren how to ride a bike. My guest on the next show will be Adam Rogers. Adam is a senior tech correspondent at Business Insider, and he covers science, technology, and our weird future. He reports on how technology changes the way we live. Our topic is about bike lanes, but we also discuss some of his other interests, including booze. Yep, booze. He's a fascinating guy, and the conversation is really interesting. I hope you'll tune in. Please remember, each show is accompanied by show notes, links, and photos on our website, outspokencyclist.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to the podcast at your favorite app. Thanks for taking time to listen. Please stay safe and stay well. And remember, there is always time for a ride. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us today on The Outspoken Cyclist with Diane Jenks. We welcome your thoughts and contributions on our Facebook page, or visit outspokencyclist.com to leave a comment on any episode. We will be back next week with new guests, topics, conversations, and news from the world of cycling. Subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app and you'll never miss an episode. The Outspoken Cyclist is a copyrighted production of DBL Promotions with the assistance of WJCU-FM Cleveland, a service of John Carroll University. Thanks again for listening, ride safely, and we'll see you next week.